Hey everybody, I'm Natasha Kirchuk, and thanks for joining us for ILTV's weekly program One-on-One with Alan Dershowitz. We want to give you, our viewers, a chance to have your questions answered by Professor Dershowitz, one of America's greatest legal minds. He's a leading expert on criminal and constitutional law, civil liberties, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Hi, Professor Dershowitz. It's so great to have you again.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
And in such an emotionally charged week. All right, let's get started. Professor, as you know, like I said, it's been a very emotionally charged week following the election of Donald Trump as the 45th President of the United States. As you know, every week we open our show with a special guest. Today we have Danny Grossman, retired Lieutenant Colonel in the Israeli Air Force and former head of the American Jewish Congress Israel office. And as you can guess, his question is focused on the future of Israeli-American relations following this historic election.
Hi, Professor Dershowitz. Having worked with you for decades, and of course I've read many of your works and admired everything you do. You may be a traditional Democrat, but your voice resonates with both Democrats and Republicans. You are right that support for Israel should never be a partisan issue. At this historic moment, I think the key message for everyone is the one simple truth that you personally have advocated for many years. Whoever is best for America will be the best president for Israel. A strong America is what Israelis want and what Israelis need. It is worth noting that while some 75% of Jews living in the United States voted for Hillary, the nearly 100,000 American Jews living in Israel who voted by absentee ballot overwhelmingly voted in favor of Trump. And since many of them voted in key states like Florida, this may have helped make a difference for Trump. So what are your thoughts at this dramatic moment in history? I'd like to hear your thoughts about Trump in terms of both America and in terms of Israel. Thank you very much.
Well, Danny, thank you. Thank you for your great question, and thank you for all the years that we've been working together to achieve support for Israel from the time you were at Harvard as a Wexner Fellow to the time you were at the American Jewish Congress, and the great work you continue to do on behalf of Israel and the heroic efforts you made as a heroic pilot in both the United States Air Force and the Israeli Air Force. So thank you again for your great efforts. Look, as usual, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is that the support for Israel was strong by both political candidates. Americans did not have to pick their candidate based on support for Israel. They could pick their candidates based on domestic and other kinds of issues. And I think support for Israel will continue, at least for the foreseeable future. And that's where the bad news comes in. I do think the fact that we had a tie election, essentially, when you think about the vote, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by about 225,000 and lost the electoral vote. If those 225,000 votes had been allocated to certain states, the electoral college result may have been different. So for purposes of analyzing the American electorate, it was a tie election, much like Bush versus Gore was a tie election. There's a lot of argument now about abolishing the electoral college and having direct election of president. There are arguments on both sides of that. But the issue is much more profound and much more global. The success of Trump, whether he had won or lost, the fact that he got 60 million votes, shows a trend around the world. We're seeing nationalism and populism all over the world. We're seeing the extreme right emboldened in many parts of the world, and many in the extreme right. Many of the populists are very happy with the election of Trump. We're seeing the growth of nationalism and sometimes even fascism in Greece, in Poland, in Lithuania, in Latvia, in Belarus, in Russia itself, in Hungary, perhaps in Austria. We're seeing the growth of neo-fascism in the Le Pen party in France, and we're seeing the growth of extremism on the left in the Labour Party in England and in some other Labour parties around the country. And Israel and the Jews thrive at the center. We do not thrive at the extremes of either right or left. Historically, we've always been trapped between the black and the red, between the black of fascism and the red of communism. So globally, I see this trend as a dangerous one for the Jewish community. Of course, it's not surprising that Americans who made Aliyah to Israel tend to represent the right wing of American people on the Israel issue. That's a tragedy. I wish more leftists and centrists would also make Aliyah to Israel. That was the case early on in its history. But the American Jews who live in Israel are not representative of American Jews in the United States or around the world. We are a divided people. We will continue to be divided. Most Jews will continue to be liberal Democrats because Tip O'Neill once said, all politics is local. Well, that's not true. Many things about politics are global, but much is local. And locally, Jews tend to support liberal Democrats on most of the domestic issues. So we wait and see. I think the most important issue in the next month or two will be whether President Obama, now free of any political constraints, will make the tragic mistake of not vetoing the French resolution at the Security Council and send the Israel-Palestine issue to the UN, where it will die. There will be no peace if the Palestinians are disincentivized from accepting Benjamin Netanyahu's offer to come to the bargaining table and bargain without preconditions. The road to peace is through Jerusalem and Ramallah, and it is not through New York, it is not through Washington, it is not through Paris or Geneva or Moscow. And if there is to be peace, if there is to be a two-state solution, the Palestinians must sit down and negotiate directly with the Israeli government, and both sides must make painful compromises.
Now, Professor, you've been a major advocate for Hillary Clinton. Are you, I mean, first of all, I'd like to know how you're feeling personally about, the results of this election, but also, are you concerned, that this result will make it more difficult for you to establish a relationship with Donald Trump because of the fact that you show that support for Clinton?
First of all, I predicted the outcome of this election. In my book, Electile Dysfunction, I said all the polls were wrong, that this was Brexit, and that we should think of this as yet another Brexit, where the polls were wrong, the bookies were wrong, the financial markets were wrong. So I was not at all surprised. I had 30 people at my house watching the election returns, and most of my friends were shocked beyond belief. We were all supporters of Hillary Clinton, but I was not at all surprised. I know Donald Trump. I've met him on several occasions. We have mutual friends. I'm a good friend of Rudy Giuliani. I already immediately wrote to Giuliani offering to help build bridges and to help heal wounds. I am a patriotic American. Donald Trump is our legitimately elected president. The election was not rigged. It was very, very close. I don't see it as a great mandate to do anything radically different from what has been done in the past. But I hope that Democrats will reach out to Republicans, and I hope that that President-elect Trump will reach out to Democrats. I hope he will appoint Joe Lieberman to be his Attorney General. I hope he will offer the job of Secretary of the Treasury to Michael Bloomberg. I hope we will see him making cabinet appointments to women and maybe Latinos, maybe even Mexicans and Muslims. Maybe that's a bridge too far for him, but I would hope that he was a candidate who emphasized certain points, but will be a president that can be more of a president of all Americans. So that's a hope, and it remains to be seen. Like the presidents who I voted for, I will continue to be a critic. I was very critical of President Obama on the Iran deal and on his foreign policy in general, and I will continue to be a loyal, patriotic critic to President-elect Trump if he carries out any of his pledges that involve any kind of bigotry or racism or homophobia or sexism. I will remain a liberal Democrat and a liberal and a patriotic supporter of whoever is president of the United States.
Well, that's good news for all of us. So now let's hear some questions from our viewers also regarding the election. May Golan is the CEO of Hebrew City and a strong conservative activist here in Israel. She wants to hear your opinion about the future of the Iranian nuclear deal, which you just mentioned, under Trump's rule, and how U.S.-Russian relations may change under his leadership.
Hello, Professor Dershowitz. My name is May Golan, and I'm an Israeli activist and the CEO of the Hebrew City nonprofit organization. My question to you is, now that Trump has won and has become the next president of the United States of America, would you think he would be able to renegotiate the Iran deal that Israel has unanimously decided it's very bad for her and her safety? And also, do you think that he would be able to maintain the friendship between Russia and the States and reduce the tension that was created before the elections? Thank you.
Great questions, May. First of all, when you say that Israel was unanimously opposed to the Iran deal, of course, J Street, which pretends to be a pro-Israel organization, was enthusiastically supportive, and they repeatedly misquoted Israeli leaders, many of whom were critical of the deal, but didn't in the end want to oppose it. There was very little enthusiasm, particularly for the sunset provision of the deal, which basically incentivizes Iran, certainly permits them to develop a nuclear arsenal in 8, 10, or 12 years. If I were President-elect Trump, or if he were to ask me my advice, I would not renegotiate the deal. What I would do is obligate Iran to stand by the provisions of the prologue to the deal, which say, and I'm not quoting, but I'm paraphrasing very accurately, I don't have it in front of me, Iran acknowledges that it will never, under any circumstances, seek to obtain or develop nuclear weapons. The word never is in the agreement itself. So I don't think it requires renegotiation. I think it requires an absolute commitment to make sure that that provision of the prologue of the agreement remains part of the agreement, and that it will be a breach of the agreement if Iran in any way seeks to develop or obtain nuclear weapons, even after the agreement is over. That's certainly what I encouraged a candidate, Hillary Clinton, to do. I told her it was my advice that if she became president, she would insist on that never provision, never obtaining or securing nuclear weapons, be regarded as an integral part of the deal. I had also urged Congress to enact legislation saying that the deal was contingent on Iran maintaining its promise never to seek to obtain or secure nuclear weapons. So if I were President-elect Trump, I would not tear up the deal. First of all, he can't do that. It's a deal involving multiple countries, and the sanctions are not going to automatically snap back, nor would I try to renegotiate. What I would try to do is interpret the deal so that the prologue's critical sentence is understood to be an integral part of the deal itself.
All right, Professor. Now let's turn to a question all the way from Sydney, Australia. Rami Tal wants to know about the role of Jerusalem in the peace process. Jerusalem is a topic that Donald Trump has mentioned various times. He's even said that he would move the capital of Israel to Jerusalem, make it the undivided capital of the Jewish state against many different people's will. So Rami wants to ask what we could expect from President Trump when it comes to Jerusalem. Let's hear what he has to ask.
Hi, my name is Rami Tal from Sydney, Australia. My brother made Aliyah and lives in Jerusalem because of his commitment to Judaism. Many leaders believe in dividing Jerusalem is the right path to peace, although there are many that oppose this way of thinking. What role does Jerusalem really have in creating peace for Israel?
Great question, Rami Tal, and I love Australia. I've been there on several occasions, always had a great time. And the Jewish community of Sydney and Melbourne are among the strongest Jewish communities in the world. Look, Jerusalem has been a source of tension for thousands of years. I just came back from the museum in New York, the Metropolitan, where they have an exhibit of 400 years of art in Jerusalem from the year, I think, 1000 to 1400, when not very many Jews lived in Jerusalem, but the Jewish presence was there artistically and in terms of memory and history, and of course the influence of the Bible on Jerusalem, and of course the residue of Jewish kingdoms, David's kingdom and other kingdoms in Jerusalem. UNESCO can't rewrite history. They try to, but they can't rewrite history. You can't separate Jews from Jerusalem. Im eshkachech Yerushalayim, if I forget Jerusalem, is part of the fear of every Jew. Jerusalem is mentioned in every prayer book. It's mentioned multiple times in all of Jewish scripture, and it's never mentioned, of course, even once in the Quran. And it plays a very minor role in Muslim ideology. If Jerusalem were not in Israel, the Muslim world would forget about Jerusalem. Sure, there are two important mosques there, but there are mosques all over the world. There are mosques in Turkey that are probably more important in some ways. In any event, Jerusalem has become a source of great political dispute. I think it was one of the issues that prevented Arafat from accepting the very generous offer that was made by President Clinton and Ehud Barak back in 2000, 2001, and it will be a sticking point in any negotiation. Obviously, the ideal goal would be an undivided Jerusalem, united Jerusalem with Israel's capital in Jerusalem, with all countries, including the United States, recognizing Jerusalem as the legitimate capital of Israel, moving all their embassies there. But there was also room in an undivided Jerusalem for the Palestinians to have a symbolic presence, a symbolic capital. Their administrative capital will always be in Ramallah, which is a beautiful, beautiful city. I visited there on a number of occasions, and it is the future of Palestine. If the Palestinians go and negotiate peace, you go to Ramallah, there isn't a single Israeli soldier there, a single Israeli policeman. It's a completely Palestinian independent, autonomic city, and it's the future if the Palestinians want it to be the future. So I would hope that Jerusalem could be the capital. President-elect Trump has said he would immediately move the embassy. Every single presidential candidate in history has made that promise. None has done it. The State Department always intrudes. Indeed, the absurd decision of the United States Supreme Court to refuse to even allow an Israeli born in West Jerusalem to put Jerusalem, Israel on his passport, and the Supreme Court affirmed that as a proper acknowledgement of presidential power. Certainly the president has the right to change that, and I would hope that President-elect Trump would change that immediately. If you're born in Jerusalem, you're born in Jerusalem, Israel. And the United States certainly recognizes de facto the capital of Israel is Jerusalem. They send all of their diplomats there to meet in Jerusalem. They're trying to play a game of not recognizing de jure while recognizing de facto. In the end, the world will have to come to recognize Jerusalem as the eternal capital of Israel and the center of the life of the Jewish people historically, in the present, and in the future.
Thanks for your response, Professor. Now, there's a lot more happening around the world besides the elections, even though it's everybody's focus right now. And one critical event that was barely noticed cuts to the very core of the problem when trying to promote peace between Israel and its neighbors. Just this week, the Palestinian Authority honored one of the terrorists who masterminded the Munich Olympic massacre by naming a school in the West Bank village of Tulkarem after him. Alejandra Cangrejo is a professional golfer from Colombia, and she wants to ask about the role of sports, education, and culture in promoting peace versus hatred.
Hi, my name is Alejandra Cangrejo, and I'm a professional golf player from Colombia. Typically, sports and politics are not supposed to mix, but we see that happening a lot lately, especially in the Middle East. During the last Olympics, there was a big uproar over how to remember the Israeli athletes that were murdered at the 1972 Munich Games. What obligation does the Olympic Committee and the world have to remembering their victims?
Well, thank you very much, Alejandro, for your question, and keep playing golf and doing great things. Look, the massacre of the Israeli athletes is one of the most important events of the 20th century. Not only for Israel, it is the beginning of the legitimation of terrorism as a tactic used by the Palestinians and then borrowed by ISIS, by Hezbollah, by you name it, every other group. Why do I say this? Because the world acknowledged that the terrorism at Munich was something that they believed had some degree of legitimacy. The Olympic Committee didn't stop the Olympics. The German government acted disgracefully by freeing the remaining terrorists who were alive. It was a totally framed up freedom. There was a fake hostage taking, and the German government had arranged with the hostage takers in advance that they would free the people. They became heroes. Television broadcast that night didn't call them terrorists, essentially called them commandos or freedom fighters. It was really the beginning, and Europe has paid its own heavy price for failure to deal with terrorism the way Israel and often the United States, have dealt with it far more effectively. Europe has been a disgrace in the war against terrorism, and Munich was the beginning of that disgrace. And it extends beyond just Germany. England has been disgraceful in the way it has dealt with Palestinian terrorism, freeing terrorists. You know, they applied a double standard. When terrorism was directed against them by members of the Irish Revolutionary Army, they were very tough, but terrorism against Israel, they were very soft. France, Spain, Italy, Switzerland, Austria, all played footsie with terrorists. And their goal was terrorism is okay as long as it doesn't affect us, as long as it doesn't attack us. Well, it's now come back to haunt them. Now terrorism is a big problem in Germany and in France and in Spain. And a large responsibility for that lies in the hands of those who didn't recognize that the massacre of Israeli athletes in Munich was beginning of the legitimation of terrorism as a tactic. So the world, not only Israel, not only the United States, ought to recognize the horrors of Munich. I have to give credit in the United States to one very important sports announcer who, even though the Olympics didn't really take notice of the anniversary of Munich, he stopped and he took notice of it, a non-Jewish announcer. And I think there are others, but just handfuls of people who understand the significance of Munich, but the world doesn't understand the significance of Munich. It's where it all began. It's where the birth of terrorism as a so-called legitimate tactic spread from Munich to the United Nations, to many of the capitals of Europe. It's been a disgrace, and it's a continuing danger to the free world.
Now, Professor, what is your response to the fact that the Palestinian Authority named a school within the West Bank after one of the terrorists from the Munich event?
Well, I think it's disgraceful, and it's a clear violation of the Oslo Accords and other commitments the Palestinian Authority has made. They are incentivizing and inciting terrorism. Look at the difference between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. Sure, there are handfuls of people in Israel who try to glorify Goldstein or Kahana, who engaged in acts of terrorism against innocent Palestinian civilians, but there are no parks. There's no official recognition. Indeed, the Israeli government does everything in its power to prevent any kind of martyrization of Jews who have engaged in acts of terrorism or encouraged acts of terrorism against Palestinians. Exactly the opposite. It's the Palestinian Authority that has Facebook pages and names stadiums and other athletic facilities after terrorist murderers. And I would think that sports organizations should take account of that. I don't think any international sports group should play in any stadium named after a terrorist. And that should become part of an international response to terrorism. Every time an athlete sets foot in a stadium named after a terrorist, who they call martyrs, and they're right, it starts with an M, but the word is murderer, mass murderer, not martyr, that encourages terrorism. And the Palestinian Authority is squarely responsible for the encouragement of terrorism in violation of the commitments they made in the Oslo Accords. And, you know, people around the world constantly condemn Israel for building an additional bathroom or bedroom anywhere in the West Bank, but we don't hear any condemnation when the Palestinian Authority incites terrorists. Everybody wants to have a park named after them. People pay millions of dollars to have buildings named after them. And the Palestinian Authority has said, hey, you want to have your family known throughout history as a martyr? Just blow up some Jewish children, stab a Jewish woman in her bed at night, kill Israeli athletes, murder innocent civilians. That'll get a park named after you. That is absolutely disgusting.
Thanks, Professor. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks so much for your time. I also want to thank all of our guests, especially Danny Grossman. If you'd like Professor Dershowitz to answer your questions, go to iltv.tv or our Facebook page and submit them. We'll see you again next week. Thanks, Alan.